Hey everyone, it's me. I'm finally done. Well, not completely. It's an evolving project, so it's never really going to be done. But I'm satisfied with it for the most part. Next season, I'm going to be redoing some of my damage testing because there's some inaccuracies and some health bar chunking that isn't completely explained yet that I want to retest further. But there's some conclusions that I've drawn that I would like to share with you guys today. So let's get the clickbaity intro into the video. Yeah, I've been damage testing and base value testing, so basically recording the exact precise amount of damage that every single relevant damage and irrelevant damage source in Destiny 2 really does to bosses. And I've been doing this for like 2 months, and this has been like almost 250 gigs of footage across maybe 10, 11 patches or so, and I'm finally mostly done for the Edge of Fate. And so you might be wondering, with all that testing, did you find anything useful? And so today I have a kind of 2-section video. The first part of the video is we're going to look at base values themselves, so maybe some weapons that are doing damage that's not correctly being reported by the game, whether it's on the health bar, on the screen, or whatever. So that's going to be part 1. And then part 2 is going to be analysis. So we're going to go over going into Renegades, what is the important stuff to like pay attention to? Like, what are the important special weapons that are good for burst damage? What are the good heavy weapons that are good for sustained damage? What are the good melees? What is stuff that you should pay attention to so that when these tuning articles come out or when changes come out next season and new weapons enter the fray, what is really going to be something that's important to compare and contrast. So let's go ahead and get started. We're going to go to our weapons tab here. Now, if you're a fan of the spreadsheet, you'll notice that the weapons and abilities tab, both of them have been completely revamped from how they used to look before. I'll give you a brief little intro as to like what's going on here because there's a lot of stuff on the screen right now, and I'll just explain it so you can kind of understand what's going on. So left to right, we have a picture of whatever weapon I use for the testing, obviously the type of weapon, the subtype, which is usually going to be archetype, or if it's an exotic, just the name of the exotic. Now, primary and secondary tick. This stuff is really to track whether or not something has been buffed or nerfed. This is basically a reference number on the screen that I can use so that if something gets buffed or nerfed, I can exactly, I know the exact number that actually showed up on my screen. This is particularly useful for weapons where, the per shot damage can vary, but maybe you have one specific really big number. So let me give you an example, right? Gallahorn, when you shoot it at a boss, you have all the little wolf pack numbers, and then you have the 2 numbers like the impact and the detonation from the actual main projectile. So for primary tick, I would take the biggest number that I can see, and then I would use that as a reference in the future if I wanted to compare it to different patches or something like that. So we have primary tick, which is usually the biggest number, like the most important number. So for an auto rifle, it would obviously just be, there's only one number to look at really. It's just the auto rifle bullet, right? And then secondary ticks is like other stuff, right? So maybe body shot for crit, ratio tracking. Some other stuff like choir has like some detonation numbers because it's kind of like an explosion in a way when you have the projectile. So, this is the informational section. We have modifiers. So, for example, choir, I did 2 different projectile modes. I did point blank, and I also did a little spaced out because in the past they've been different in terms of performance. So yeah, that's the left informational section. Then we have these 2 sections over here, visual and a health bar. So in the past, these 2 were combined. The visual section, this really just tells you how much damage the game thinks the weapon is doing. So with choir, let's say you shoot a boss in the head, and on Savathun, for example, a lot of you have been asking, why do you use Savathun? I use Savathun because she has the thread cutter buff, which basically makes it so that your weapons and abilities and stuff like that do way more damage than they normally do, but she has like, a substantial amount of health. And so this really helps with base value testing because it allows you to get a finer degree of precision, especially for primaries where you're doing like single digit amounts of damage. In the Edge of Fate, that a rounding error at like 41 can be like a fairly substantial amount of damage, whereas in the final shape, you had primaries doing hundreds and thousands of damage. So it was really not that big of a problem. So this is one thing I've designed to combat that. Modifier here, you'll see that in both of these kind of groupings. This basically just tells you how much different the testing environment that I performed these tests in were compared to a typical raid and dungeon where you have +0 and no buffs or anything like that. So for example, here for typical Savathun tests, I have 13.12, and then I also have a Well of Radiance, so that's also there, 1.25. And then I also divide by some other factors, which we'll discuss in a second, because the sandbox has become considerably more complex since I started doing damage testing. So that's visual, right? Visual, you simply write down the tick. So for example, auto rifles, I know when I'm sitting in a well with 200 weapons on Savathun, they do it 383 to her head. I divide this factor out, I divide some other factors out, and then we're left with the actual value that you would see on a boss. So all of these numbers here, in theory, if I've done my job correctly, if you were to go shoot a boss in a raid or a dungeon with sub 100 weapons and you didn't have any sort of buff or anything like that, you should get these numbers. You should get exactly these numbers, or they'll be rounded up or whatever. So they should be one number away. But this number should be more accurate than actually what you're seeing on screen in terms of decimals. Then you have the health bar section. So the health bar section, this is in theory very similar to the visual value section. Obviously there's some error here because, you know, you can have plus minus 1 pixel of error when it comes to these things. But yeah, this is where I input the health bar data. So Savathun has her health bar and then I measure it. Savathun unfortunately doesn't have wipe screen reporting for damage. And so there's some other bosses here. You know, I've used Templar for some of these things because they were just way more annoying to count all the numbers on Savathun. And so there's a variety of reasons why I might have changed bosses. And you can see here the multiplier obviously changes from boss to boss. Templar would only have like, I don't know, well and surges, whereas Savathun has, you know, well and her thread cutter buff, which is absolutely massive. So then you compare the visual and the health bar value and you do a little ratio. And so this ratio here is health bar value divided by visual value, and you see what it is. So all of these values that are within like 5%, all pretty accurate. Savathun itself, you know, because she has that insanely high multiplier, seeing numbers that are very, very close to basically being 1 as the ratio is pretty common here. And you'll see that I flag anytime that there is an issue. And the issue would be something like where you're more than 2 pixels off. That would be more than margin of error on both ends, really. And then maybe something that's over like 5 to, you know, 10%. I think I went over 5% or under like 95% would be something that's like a ratio that's like worth looking into. And then we record the patch that we actually tested this on, which is really, really useful because when something gets buffed or nerfed, I can tell whether I've tested it post patch or post buff, which is really, really helpful. And as you can see here, these tests, you know, very, very expansive, 9.1.0.2, 9.0.0.8. There's a lot of the different tests here. A lot of the ability tests were done on 9.1.5.5. So I've been doing this for a while, as you can see, right? And there are a lot of rows in this spreadsheet. There are 324, well, I guess minus these two. So 322 weapon damage sources that we've tracked. And then you have new gear bonus, which some of the weapons that I tested were in fact either featured gear exotics or new gear tier 5, tier 4, whatever, which, you know, I noted here. And then that was divided out when I was calculating base values. We have 200 weapons. So for specials, 1.15, for heavy, 1.1, makes sense. And then I also measured crit ratios because that might be something people are interested at a very high precision value. So I have crit ratios as well. And yeah, I think I've explained the rest. So little intro to explain this like absolute massive like wall of numbers here so that some of the stuff that I will say in the next little bit will make more sense. So first up, let's talk about weapons. So we're on the weapons tab right now, and I want to go over some of the highlights of this spreadsheet. So number 1 is Choir 1, which happens to be pretty high up on our screen here. Apparently sometimes chunks when you are spaced away from a boss. So when you're hip firing at a boss and you space enough that like the little projectiles actually have time to fan out and bloom and splash a little bit, there is a little bit of chunking. Now, I was not able to consistently recreate this chunking on multiple different bosses, but it did happen enough that there might be something going on here. I'll retest anything that is like red and has like chunking next season. Just to make sure, unless I'm 100% sure that chunking is consistent. So Choir is one of those things where I'm not 100% sure, but it's something to investigate. This never happened, for reference, when I was using the hit scan mode or when I was using the projectiles, but I was point blank barrel stuffing a boss with Choir. So that's something to note. Next up, I know I didn't talk too much about high impact frame bows when they came out outside of the Temporal Blast video. Now we've done some substantial testing on the different bolt types. As you can see here, the two best are serrated bolts and charge bolts by a fairly significant margin. Serrated bolts, this includes their retrieval, which can be kind of annoying. But charge bolts, you can see that their total damage actually exceeds that of serrated bolts with retrieval at 1834, 1835-ish damage per bolt, which is pretty good. There's some chunking here, which I need to retest for, but I wasn't able to reproduce this chunking on some other bosses, but the base value seems to be pretty accurate. Okay, next up, the probably biggest egregious like visual error in terms of, you know, health bar reporting is Delicate Tomb. Now, the only reason why I'm not going to retest this is because I'm fairly confident this is the case because I have seen this on multiple bosses. I've tested on like Riven and like a different dungeon boss as well. And then I've seen this across multiple patches as well. So a bit of a weird thing here, but for those of you that are not really understanding what's going on here and why this is so red, Delicate Tomb, when you shoot a boss with it, the amount of damage you do to the health bar is actually half of what it says it does on the web screen as well as visually on your screen, which I've never seen a weapon with this much disparity between how much it does to the health bar versus how much it says it does on your screen. And it might have to do with this is like a fusion rifle that has like 16 bolts or something per shot, which is like a very high amount of numbers, I guess, like in a small amount of time. So that could be potentially confusing the game, but it's exactly half. So I'm not sure what's going on here, but yeah, Delicate Tomb, I've never seen a weapon with this much disparity. It's crazy, and it's exactly 50% as well, and I've seen this like multiple times. So Bungie, please look into this. I suppose Delicate Tomb is doing half the effective damage it should be, I suppose, which is quite odd. Okay, next up, we have various hand cannons. So let's scroll down over here. So you see here, there's a bunch of hand cannons with like a bunch of gaps here, but it's nothing as big as Delicate Tomb, obviously, but you see like 94%, 5%, 97%, 10 plus 10, 11%. This is pretty common. Whenever I did Lucky Pants testing in the past, there was definitely like health bar disparities that couldn't really be accounted for. And so, yeah, this is just, I don't know, like I'll retest this next season and try to get consistent results out of it. But Malfeasance, that's a classic. That one always had like, 3-5% chunking. So it's, kind of predictable to see that here. Really anything that says a legally modded holster, you're going to see probably some chunking here. So yeah, nothing too crazy, nothing extremely significant or anything like Delicate Tomb, but just something that I thought I'd mention. Third iteration, if we scroll all the way down to the scout rifle section here, third iteration, where are you? Yeah, third iteration, this was pretty consistent on both Templar and Savathun where I tested this. I test amalgamation round by just firing the first, like ADSing, and then firing a single amalgamation round and waiting for the mark to wear off so I can get consistent values for every single amalgamation round. And I don't have like the mark debuff on the successive amalgamation rounds. So yeah, for some reason, exactly 20% chunking here, like 20% extra damage. Part of this might have to do with the fact that there's a lot of effects in this game, which we'll talk about in a second here, where if you apply an effect on a shot, like by shooting a target, you apply an effect. Sometimes the health bar damage receives that effect, but visually your damage doesn't. So this is similar to like the does bait and switch apply in your first rocket kind of thing that we talked about a long time ago on this channel. New Land Beyond also has the same issue, which I don't think I've actually written in my notes here, but we'll briefly take a look at New Land Beyond. So New Land Beyond, you take a look here, at 0 stacks, you'll see that it has 16% chunking. That's because at 1 stack, New Land Beyond actually has like a 15.7% buff. And so you'll see here that when I reached 78 to 79 stacks, I literally stacked NLB up to 78 stacks in Savathun. This chunking issue completely disappeared, right? And this 16% thing was consistent. And so I think New Land Beyond actually does to the health bar the amount of damage that you would get by having the stack that you're about to obtain. So if you're at 0 stacks and you shoot a boss in the head, it will do to the health bar the same damage as if you had 1 stack, if that makes sense. Tractor Cannon, where are you? Okay, so Tractor Cannon has always been weird. 2 things I want to note here. Number 1 is Tractor Cannon has always had chunking issues. You do less damage to the health bar than it says you do on the wipe screen. This has always been a thing with Tractor. But not until now have I been able to get this so consistent. Also, in the past when I tested Tractor, I didn't really account for range. Tractor is, by the way, I've tested every single weapon in this game. Tractor is by far the most range sensitive weapon in this game. You have to be literally, your nose has to be rubbing against a boss's membranes to get Tractor to have consistent damage numbers. It has insane damage fall off. So I face tanked the boss and made sure I got the maximum number every single time here. And I did 20-ish% less damage to the health bar than I actually, set on the screen. And this was also accounting for like already having debuff applied. So I applied the Tractor debuff first, and then I started recording and did the successive shots. So it's nothing to do with like buff application or anything like that either. There was just actually chunking here, which is pretty weird. Not that matters really that much because I don't think anyone cares about Tractor DPS, but that is a thing that you might want to be aware of. Okay, next up, we have our sniper rifle that recently, will in the future get a honing speed buff, I guess, reload speed stacking buff. Honed Edge Izzy. We've talked about this before, has consistent 25% chunking, does exactly 25% more to the health bar. It's maybe the only relevant weapon in the game that actually has consistent chunking, which is nice because it's good. It's like 25% more free damage. I hope Bungie doesn't fix this because it would definitely significantly hamper the weapon if they got rid of this. This is very consistent on every boss that I've seen. Even with this buff, it's not like insanely OP. All my spreadsheet numbers when I do Izzy testing account for this 25%, so that's added in already. And so, yeah, you would see the number drop by 25% if this was gotten rid of somehow. I don't even know what causes this, but yeah. Okay, and then finally, the last thing I want to talk about, there's a bunch of other red things that you might see here, by the way, that I'm not pointing out because they are tests that I've gone and redone, but I haven't put into the spreadsheet that I know are like a testing error or like, one-off type of thing, like the game is just being weird. Okay, so last but not least, we have swords. Any sword that has like an uppercut heavy attack. So I'm even including stuff like Lament where you don't have any sort of pre-stacked Banshee's Wail and you're just doing a right click where it like pierces upward through the boss. Any sword that has an attack like that actually chunks the boss. Some of them do up to like 20% more as you can see here, but usually it's on the order of like 5, 10, 15% more. So it's, yeah, any sword that has that kind of uppercut animation besides wave sword frames, because the wave sword, when you flick up with it, it doesn't like do multiple damage ticks. So yeah, that's something to be aware of. And then like caster frames also, like their heavy attack chunks for more as well, even though they're not like the exact same. But I've seen this consistently as well, including in fire teams. That's it for weapons. If you're curious about any weapons that are behaving outside the norm, pretty straightforward stuff. Delicate Tomb and Izzy are like the 2 big ones. I'll revisit anything that's red, like I said, next season. And let's move on to abilities. You'll notice this spreadsheet tab is like a little bit more compressed because there is no new gear and nothing like that. So I didn't actually test 200 stat this time around because I think last time's testing was substantial enough to basically say that almost everything is normal scaling. So I'm not really going to bother with, testing 200 stat, just kind of trust that the stat behaves correctly for the most part. Obviously, some components of some abilities are not considered grenades or not considered supers or whatever. For example, if a super jolts, then the jolt damage is not going to go up as your super stat increases because jolt is a non-scaling effect. That's just like fundamentals knowledge. I'm not going to like test and be like, I've proven that it's not exactly 45%, you know what I'm saying? So first, submunition based grenades often delete visual values and appear to chunk the health bar more. I'm talking about swarm grenades and I believe skip grenades. So you can see here, skip grenade, yeah, there's like a little bit of chunking there, but swarm grenades, one of the tests, there's 54% chunking. However, when you see the actual like damage number, it's like not that high. It's just like 989. Normally, right, if you take a look at these two tests here, I have two swarm grenade tests. One was without ashes and one was with ashes. I believe the ashes one only needed 2 nades to ignite and the non-ashes one needed 3 nades to ignite. And you can see here that if you needed only 2 nades to ignite and the ignition would take up more like damage per nade, I guess, on average, it would increase the average, then why would the wipe screen value be lower? So this is actually the true damage value of the nade. If you don't believe me, guys, literally put on Apotheosis Veil, go place a well or something and throw like 4 swarm grenades in a row at something and you'll see the numbers just disappear. Or like the swarm submunitions appear to just instantly explode, but the damage still happens to the health bar. So this is not cause for alarm or anything. Swarm grenades in the past, you guys remember when swarm grenades in bubbles or something were causing issues, and then that also happened at the same time as the pack hunter fix, because I think the pack hunter submunitions are like coded the same way as like swarm submunitions, but these are still causing issues. If you throw enough swarm grenade projectiles, they just kind of like delete each other out of the air, or the swarm grenade appears to instantly explode, and then for some reason it's just like it does the damage, it just like doesn't show up on your screen. So yeah, just weird. Just ignore this. This is not like actual chunking or anything. It's just like the projectile numbers are getting deleted, kind of like with Deathbringer. Storm grenades, I'm going to retest these next season, but yeah, they appear to chunk. Savathun, I've learned, like I did a lot of testing on Savathun because again, like the thread cutter buff thing, but she definitely has her like caveats, and I do want to like maybe move away from her in the future for when we try to do like accurate testing where there's like obviously issues that are occurring. So for stuff like this, I'll probably try to retest in like the shooting range next season, and we'll see if that fares any better. But yeah, storm grenades, maybe chunking, maybe not. They also, for some reason, reported doing less damage than pulse grenades this season on the wipe screen, like visually, which is abnormal. In past seasons, storm grenades have always done more than pulse grenades. So I'll definitely have to revisit that testing. For now, I've put like these new lower numbers in the spreadsheet for now, like in the other tabs where I'm actually referencing grenade damage, but it's not a big deal. I don't think people are like super bent over like using storm grenades for damage right now. Anyway, another super weird thing that I found during testing, which I'm just going to write off as like a weird testing thing, is Titan abilities on Savathun just do 20% less damage to her health bar. I have no idea why this happens, but it was every single Titan ability. So look at this. Ballistic Slam, 80%-ish, right? Hammer Strike, 80%-ish. Seismic Strike, Shield Bash, Shield Throw, Shiver Strike, all 80%-ish. Monte Carlo bayonet locked on Titan. That's not even like a Titan specific thing, but I was just on Titan. 80%. Right? Throwing Hammer, Thunderclap, 80%. And then Exodus Rockets, like what? That's not even like an ability, right? It's like a exotic thing. And it was still 80%. So I double checked, triple checked my footage and stuff, and for some reason, Titan just does 20% less damage to Savathun. I mean, the base values appear to be accurate compared to other bosses, so I just used the base values. I didn't use the health bar values, but you can see here, anytime there's like a random 80% here, just like expect it to be a Titan thing. Like look down here, look at all these Titan supers. Thunder Crash, Twilight Arsenal, all 80%. Again, we're going to move away from Savathun for a lot of these tests, anything that's like weird. Another thing is crystals will cause both increases and decreases in health bar damage depending on how you use them. So Glacial Quake and Glacier Grenades will typically do less damage to the health bar. So if you take a look here, let's go to Grenade, let's go to Glacier. You'll see here there's like a little bit of negative damage into the health bar. Nothing too crazy, right? I've seen that before. And then if you go to supers and you go to Glacial Quake and you go to heavy attacks, which is how people traditionally use Glacial Quake, you'll see there is some damage lost. And then, however, if you do Howl of the Storm in your super, so Howl of the Storm was for Fisher's Biotic Enhancements, you'll see here that sometimes the number goes up. I never saw it go below. I always saw the number chunk upward. So super weird, super interesting. Don't know why that happens. I did a bunch. And you guys probably remember me failing on stream over and over doing Howl of the Storm and stuff, but I did a bunch of these tests, and every single time I did Howl of the Storm, it was either equal or above in terms of damage to the health bar, and then every time I did Glacial Quake heavy attacks, it was either below or the same. Blade Barrage, wherever that is, that's going to be up here. Blade Barrage was doing significantly less damage to the health bar than reported on the shooting range like meter, as well as the wipe screen on various raid bosses. So I was really confused by that. I'll definitely retest this next season more extensively to get like a more conclusive result, but it was pretty consistent. Yeah, I didn't think I got a single Blade Barrage test where the amount of damage done to the health bar was accurate to the amount of damage that I did on the wipe screen or visually when I counted up the blade explosions. Nighthawk, I remember I told you guys that Nighthawk doesn't chunk anymore and doesn't give 10% for free anymore. I tested this, I think 3 different times on 3 different bosses, and it still gives 10% now for some reason. So I don't know. This might be like a choir thing where it's like situational and it like chunks sometimes. No idea why, but in the test that I did, 3 different bosses, Radiant Celestial Nighthawk was doing 10% more to the health bar pretty consistently. And then finally, this is not going to be a surprise for those of you that are familiar with the spreadsheet, Mobius Quiver, almost every single variant besides just base Mobius Quiver with nothing else, has some sort of chunking issue. Now, I had a theory. What if it's because it chunks for more? Because when you do a Mobius Quiver, like the first set of arrows, they apply their own debuff, but visually they don't. So I was like, what if I tractor the boss first and then I do Mobius Quiver? And lo and behold, includes debuff pre-tractored, includes debuff pre-tractored, they're still chunking. So I guess Mobius Quiver is just a super that chunks. Just naturally, it just chunks. So yeah, I guess I'll extensively test this again, retest this next season, see if there's any changes in that, and then try to report like a more accurate base value to use. So that is it for chunking, kind of a boring part of the video. Let's get into analysis. Shall we? So I'm going to go ahead and start with melees. So we're going to go to the sustain tab real quick. We're going to filter by melee. I think there's like 4 categories of melees that are potentially relevant, and then we'll talk about some future melee categories as well. So the first melee category that I'm sure you're aware of is grapple melee. Grapple melee, this is excluding unravel damage as well, does around 13,000 DPS with Syntho combination blow and 13k DPS. That's kind of a hard number to visualize, to think about. And I've seen some people say it's fine in its current iteration, you know, only solo players use it or whatever. But I want to kind of give you a reference as to like how OP grapple melee is right now. So grapple melee, let's say you're able to get 200 grenade, 200 melee. You have combination blow times 3, facet of courage, biotic enhancements, and use 1-2 punch. 13,000 DPS. What is that equivalent to? Let's go to the swap tab, shall we? That is equivalent to, okay, that's around 13,000. Ah, yes. Spamming Nighthawks with no super fill recharge. So this is the equivalent of if you were hard cheating and you had not the infinite golden gun spam thing where you like fire goldies at like 9,000 RPM, but like imagine you were able to pop a goldie, shoot the goldie, come out of the goldie, and then immediately pop another goldie, and then shoot the goldie, and then come out of the goldie with Nighthawk over and over again. That is the equivalent DPS of grapple melee right now with Synthos and combination blow. So yeah, that's probably not healthy for the game, as fun as it is for like solos and stuff like that and making certain things possible. But yeah, that is that is probably not intentional. The next best thing is going to be for grapple melee at least, or well, not next best thing. Obviously there's other options in between, but the other option that is commonly used, I guess, or commonly beloved is Banner of War, right? Banner of War with Synthos instead of combination blow and facet of courage. What does that equate to? So that's 7.5k DPS. So what's that equivalent to? Well, if we go to the swap tab, that is about equivalent to spamming Star Eater Scales, 6 Beasts of Light stack, golden guns. So popping a 3-shot goldie with Star Eater Scales, bang, 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 immediately ending, popping another one, bang, 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 over and over. So you can see even the Titan version, 7.5k sustained DPS for very little ammo expenditure and just being surrounded by ads. Pretty strong, right? Pretty strong. Even the significantly weaker version than, you know, actual grapple melee. We'll see what happens to, I don't know, abilities article isn't out yet. We've been comparing this to like other supers. What about like weapons? So let's go ahead and select all here. And let's go ahead and look at some of these weapons. By the way, in the sustain and swap tab, I've updated the base values for everything for more precise values. You see here, grapple melee, it's down to 3 decimal places. Every single option on the spreadsheet is down to 3 decimals of precision now. So very, very precise base values. So yeah, a lot of this stuff, by the way, is like was overestimates because of how the rounding system works in D2 now. So because of the number crunch. And so a lot of these numbers are moved down like ever so slightly, but some of these were like testing error and stuff like that. So this should be in theory the most accurate ranking this tab has ever had, really, but let's keep going. So what is the closest weapon, like closest realistic weapon option to grapple melee damage? Well, that's going to be this. I'm not going to include slide shots around it. That's troll, right? So let's talk about this. This is how much DPS you can do with a Hezen with Envious and Elemental Honing, Time Loss Magazine active, and not including other weapons, but you're simulating shooting to other weapons. So let's say you're shooting 2 traces that do no damage, and you're just proccing envious repeatedly. What is the DPS of just the rocket? Well, it's around 6k. And the thing is, if you're doing damage this quickly with a 2 mag Hezen because of time lost, you run out of ammo in about 10.5 seconds. Whereas with grapple melee, as I'm sure you know, you can do it basically indefinitely as long as you have like a couple adds. So yeah, that is the state of melee balance right now. Obviously, I think Bungie probably knows this internally and is probably trying to posture to hit melees downward, specifically grapple melee, I guess, in relation to some of these other options. The next melee that is potentially relevant is throwing hammer. So throwing hammer is actually kind of underrated. If grapple melee did not exist, throwing hammer would actually probably be used by a lot of people for solo damage and stuff like that, because it is a very, very easy to use damage option. And it just requires Roaring Flames. I'm not even Worm God, right? Not even expecting like full Worm God stacks or anything. Just Roaring Flames and Biotic Enhancements and a Rapid Fire Shotgun. And you're just shooting, hitting. 5.3k is not bad, right? That's like up there with like the best rocket option. So pretty good stuff. Surprisingly solid DPS, just overshadowed by grapple melee. So I don't know. I think, I mean, a lot of people have been using like Worm God Hammer for like doing portal stuff. That's pretty common, but for actual boss DPS, it's not even bad. It's not even bad. I mean, in the past, it's been absolutely disgusting, but right now in its current iteration, it's not even that bad, right? Now you might be asking, what about Melis Panoplia? Good question. I know a lot of people have asked me about Melis Panoplia. Let's go ahead and filter by melee once again. And yeah, Melis Panoplia is just worse. It's just worse. And people ask me like, oh, Aegis, what about the thing where like if you're right next to a target and you get the 2 extra damage numbers, does that change anything? No. It goes from being bad to right? Okay. So yeah, it's not that good. Would not really recommend using Melis Panoplia for hammer DPS if that's something that you want to do. Third, we have Glaive Melee. I wouldn't consider Glaive Melee to be applicable, really, but we can talk about it. You have like 3 options. You have Winterbite, Vex Caliber, and normal Glaives. I'm not going to include Vex Caliber because it is basically the same DPS as Winterbite, except it requires Void Overshield, which is more annoying. It is a special, but you know, whatever. We're not going to talk about it. So Winterbite, and we have Adaptive Glaive. Now note here, I did say excludes shatter damage, so this is realistically closer to like 5k DPS, but you know, it's somewhere around here. The only problem with Winterbite and with Adaptive Glaives is that they are both just susceptible to grapple melee overshadowing them, because this is basically the same requirements as Syntho grapple melee. It's combination blow ×3 and Trident Vice, which has the same requirements as Syntho, just for glaive stuff. And I mean, it's easy to do, right? It's easy to do, but you still got to get combination blow refreshes, so you may as well just grapple melee. So yeah, the only thing curious potentially about glaive meleeing is that next season, the Winter's Guile change might, like the melee speed thing that was mentioned, might speed up your ability to glaive melee. So that could make Warlock a potential contender here for glaive melee, but Warlock doesn't have an unpowered melee damage booster like combination blow. So I honestly don't think it's really even going to rank that high, even if we do think it's a potentially viable strategy. So I think glaive melee, it's middle of the pack for a reason. It has the same requirements as the stuff above it. It's just less damage. And finally, another thing I wanted to mention is Flesh It Storm, because that was a popular melee option for a little while. Got nerfed, and as you can see, 4.4k DPS for having to be on Strat and Titan with Flesh It Storm, and then having a Song of Flame and all that stuff. Like, for all the setup it's required to do, I don't think this is probably ever going to be an option on anyone's table ever again. But it's there, and the DPS is not like horrible, but it's just, cost benefit analysis not worth. In the future, we're going to look into 2 things: Winter's Guile, glaive melee, potentially interesting, right? With the melee speed thing, we just have to test it out. Don't know how fast the melees are going to be. And then also Winter's Guile Lightning Surge, because as you can see, your biotic enhancements, facet of courage, no like 1-2 punch or anything, 3.4k, not horrible. So with the Winter's Guile buff, could be up in the 4k range, 4.5k range, who knows. Again, melees are really just dominated by one thing and one thing alone, and that is the Green Man Rope. Let's go ahead and briefly talk about grenades. Let's go ahead and draw an arbitrary kind of threshold here and decide what grenades we're going to talk about versus not talk about. First of all, there's no grenades that are like realistically usable for damage that surpass around the 5k mark. You might see Void Wall here. Void Walls don't stack with each other. So, you can throw one and do pretty good total damage, but they don't stack with each other. So we're going to be looking at Pulse Grenade first. The only grenades really worth mentioning here are going to be stuff like Verity Touch Fusion. Verity Touch Fusion is actually over here at like 5.1-ish k. Again, kind of unrealistic to keep 5 stacks across a fire team, right? So this is going to be kind of very situational. Everything here that uses Verity, again, situational, right? You have Hoyle, which is like more realistic. You have Sunbracers, repeated activations. You guys saw me use that in some environments that are contest adjacent. So this is kind of viable in some cases, but I wouldn't recommend it for everyone. Actually, that was more of an apotheosis thing, but Sunbracers was present as well. You have Hoyle Touch Storm, which again, we're going to revisit this value. It should probably be higher, probably be in the 5k range, but this might be a bugged value or something like that. Hailfire Spike, which is the only prismatic nade to have any sort of decent swap DPS at 3.6k, but obviously you can't throw it very often because it lasts a very long time. Chaos Accelerant, Magnet, handheld Supernova stuff. People have been talking about this all the time. I don't think it's super viable for boss damage. It's very, very difficult to get all of the projectiles to hit a boss unless you're inside the boss's hitbox while you're throwing. Trust me, I know, because I've been doing testing. And also the charge time on the nade just inherently decreases its swap DPS. So I don't think people are going to use it outside of like burst instances like Solo Caretaker or something where like nade damage is boosted significantly. And then you have like regular touch fusions and you have flux grenades. By the way, flux grenades were buffed, as I'm sure you guys know. They do around the same damage per nade as like a fusion grenade, except fusion grenades are tied to the solar subclass, and the solar subclass has access to Ember of Benevolence and other things that synergize better with grenade regeneration. So I don't think flux grenade is that good. Let's go ahead and talk about some tick options next. You might be wondering, what is a tick option? So tick options are just things that do a gradual amount of damage over a long period of time. Stuff like Anarchy, Finality's Augur, Area Denial, Witherhoard, Arc Soul, etc. So I kind of grouped them all into this one group, and obviously they come from all different walks of life here, but let's briefly go ahead and talk about them. So first comparison, Finality's Augur versus Anarchy. I'm pretty sure everyone's familiar with this at this point. Finality's has higher DPS with bait and switch, and it also has significantly higher total damage as well, and I would argue it's significantly easier to use, even though you kind of have to be aware of when the turret is gone to place your new turret. The amount of time you have is like 20 plus seconds, whereas Anarchy's double traps run out in 10. And you also have to reload Anarchy, and you never have to reload Finality. So yeah, bit of a difference between the two. Don't think there's ever reason to use Anarchy again, for DPS at least. Let's talk about Eunoia Hellion, right? So Eunoia Hellion, I'm sure you guys know, the damage of the ignition, for whatever reason, does not get boosted by the grenade stat. So this would technically be higher. Eunoia Hellion does 800 DPS, which is fairly substantial, actually. That's pretty close to Anarchy, right? So not bad. But unfortunately, yeah, the ignition doesn't scale with the grenade stat. If it did, this would probably be, I don't know, like maybe 850, 900 maybe DPS. So that's a shame, but it is what it is. And then in terms of DPS, the amount of DPS that Eunoia adds to Hellion compared to regular Ashes Hellion is approximately 35%. So that's the difference between 799 and 592. Yeah, about 35%. And you can make up 200 DPS in other exotics and, running Sanguine and stuff like that, or Metiodoxia in the future. So Hellion, you can kind of take it or leave it. I would say Getaway Artist probably outshines Eunoia if you're specifically looking to do turret damage, because obviously you could afford to run both Hellion and then also have an amplified Arc Soul that potentially jolts. Next, we have Ionic Sentry. Ionic Sentry does around 600 DPS, including the Bolt Charge activations, as well as having Spark of Frequency. Not that impressive, honestly, for like an activated ability. Not that impressive. That requires kills. So Stormskeep Bolt Charge, this basically means if you were to have the maximum possible Bolt Charge rate, like you were using like a Caster Frame Ergo or something, and you had like a Area Denial ticking, which basically gets you Bolt Charge as quickly as possible. The maximum potential rate for Bolt Charge is like every 1.46 seconds, like the max practical Bolt Charge rate. And if you had Bolt Charge this often, which you probably won't, your DPS increases 600. So that's just something to note in case you're wondering how much Bolt Charge can potentially add to a damage rotation. Next up, we have Area Denials versus Witherhoard. DPS is pretty similar, right? You have one with Honing times 5, 554. Witherhoard Direct Stick, 454. Arc Soul Amplified versus regular Arc Soul adds 125% extra DPS, as I'm sure you guys know. Shoots 5 instead of 3, and also shoots a lot faster. Around 500 DPS added versus Arc Soul Regular adding only 210. Seeing this number among all these other numbers might remind you guys that like why people don't necessarily go like true Arc and give Arc Souls to their teammates, because this is a very low increase in DPS, and kind of brings up a discussion of like comparing Arc Soul versus Stormskeep from Titan. You can see that there's quite a disparity there. Even if you're not going for that max practical Bolt Charge rate, the difference is still quite large in terms of team buffing potential. Finally, a couple things to talk about. Weaver's Call gives you around 226 extra DPS, and that's if you're on Thread of Evolution and not on Prismatic. A lot of people saw the Weaver's Call buff and they're like, yo, it's going to spawn a lot of Threadlings, it's going to give me a lot of extra passive damage. Realistically, maximum practical rate for Weaver's Call, it has an internal cooldown. Every 2 or so seconds, you spawn one Threadling. It's fine. It's good passive damage, but it's not amazing. Finally, some effect sources. First, we have Jolt. I added Jolt here because we have some popular jolting sources like Getaway Artist with Facet of Dominance, stuff like that. If you are jolting a target, I think the maximum rate you can jolt is like once per second, which would give you extra damage equivalent to 129. And then Unravel at its typical rate of like 3 missiles every 1.3-ish seconds is an extra damage value of 118. So yeah, compared to the past where people were applying Volt Shot with fusions and stuff like that, now that the scaling is all gone, you see stuff like Jolt and Unravel have very, very low values that they contribute to DPS, and they also can't be shared across multiple people, unlike stuff like Arc Soul and, Bolt Charge and whatever. Just some notes here in terms of like where things are in the sandbox. In the future, I might add Volatile and Shatter here. I'm pretty sure Volatile and Shatter are even worse than both of these. That's it for tick values. Let's go ahead and start talking about some more important stuff. Let's talk about supers next. I'm going to start and kind of draw a line in the sand and give you a viable damage super threshold. So if we go ahead and look at our sustain tab and we deselect our filters and we just go ahead and look at the actual sustain tab, where does decent DPS start to come into play? So I would say personally, decent DPS is somewhere around the 3,500 mark, right? You're looking at New Land Beyond with max stacks, Sleeper, Duality with On Black Wings. You have Mint at this threshold as well. That's a great benchmark right there, Mint, right? 3,500. So if you're going to use a super for damage, you should be out damaging your weapons, right? You should be out damaging your weapons. So I said the viable damage super mark should be around 4,000 swap DPS, around 4K, okay? So looking at that, what makes the cut? That's basically starts here. So some notable failures. Song of Flame doesn't make the cut. Song of Flame doesn't make the cut. But part of that is because I'm not including weapon usage here. However, if you're doing like the Star Eater thing, it's not really conducive to like weapon usage. So really you're going to be looking at something like Claw Necro, which is conducive to weapon usage and does similar total damage. So that could potentially be competitive if you add in like Trench Barrel usage or something like that into the mix. But yeah, Song of Flame, just generally speaking, its DPS is pretty low, not worth using if you're just going to spam it compared to like actual like good weapon options. Arc Staff with Raid and Flux and no Shield Crush, also not very good, 2,900, right? Not very good. Silk Strike, very popular option right now that's been carried by Shield Crush because Shield Crush is a 1.5 times modifier on it. Without Shield Crush, this thing does 3.4k, which is, again, not very good. Similar to like Sleeper DPS, you may as well just use weapons and try to pick a higher burst super. And then finally, we have Daybreak with Dawn Chorus, which is grounded. Honestly, kind of surprised me. I thought it would have lower DPS, but I was informed that there is a way that you can use Daybreak so that your projectile actually hits the intersection between the ground and a boss's body. And by hitting this intersection, you do an extra like 2 damage numbers. And so that was what pushed Daybreak kind of over the edge here. And that's why there's a grounded modifier here. That's why it does 3.6k, but still not enough to meet my arbitrary threshold of 4k DPS. So what does make the cut? So what does make the cut, which is like decent options, but not crazy options. We have Chaos Reach with Geomag Stabilizers at 4.1k. Basically does Curus total damage at 35k. You see Curus up here does 33k, so pretty similar, except Curus is like instant and Chaos Reach takes quite a bit longer, as you can see, at like, 9 seconds. Storm's Edge with Starter Scales, also similar situation, does similar damage to Curus's per knife, by the way, so 3 knives would be 33k. Yeah, similar situation, takes a while. Oh yeah, you can see it here, 33k, 8 seconds. Higher DPS, but similar situation to Chaos Reach. No real reason to use this thing. Also, I did DPS comparisons for Storm's Edge and Mobius Quiver of like shooting weapons in between casts and seeing if that's better significantly or anything like that. It's not that much better, but again, doesn't account for the weapons that are being used in between. So you could do some sort of rotation if you wanted, but it's more effort for not necessarily a bountiful result. Hammer of Soul variants, we have Roaring Flames and Soul Invictus and Biotic, and we have Feast of Light and Facet of Courage at max distance for the shrapnel damage increase. DPS is a little bit more impressive, but still kind of disappointing in the grand scheme of things, so not really going to recommend Hammer of Soul. You can see the total damage there is not insanely impressive compared to something like Curus, and of course the DPS is kind of lacking as well. Next up, we have Silence and Squall. Silence and Squall, I've kind of recommended this in the past as a sort of slow applicator, I guess. But you can see here the total damage done by Silence and Squall, even when you have stuff like Starter access, is horrible. So I would not recommend using Silence and Squall for damage. It's decent swap DPS, but doesn't even do half a Nighthawk's worth of damage. As a reminder, Nighthawk does like 25k, and a base Silence and Squall with Facet of Ruin, which is probably how you're going to be using Silence and Squall if you're going to be using it for damage, is only 11k, because you're going to be on Prismatic and not on Stasis, right? So pretty bad there. Not looking too good. Interesting reference point here. Glacial Quake with no exotic on. Heavy attacks, Whisper of Fissures on a target like Riven, so all the crystals are hitting. But on a lot of targets, you can get most of the crystals to hit. 73k total damage at 5,700 DPS, right? So that is a good reference point that kind of like shows you how, I guess, the other supers are not performing too well, even if their numbers look, decent compared to like Glacial Quake. For the percast supers that I was mentioning earlier, so I was talking about stuff like Mobius Quiver and Storm's Edge, you can try shooting weapons in between each cast, but honestly, like, just shooting the volleys repeatedly, for example, with Star Eater Moby's Quiver is pretty high DPS, and it's probably not even worth shooting a weapon in between your casts unless you are specifically trying to draw out the debuff time for a reason. And then finally, Glacial Quake, if we look up here at some of the more, tippy top options, is an insane total damage outlier, right? Like the heavy attacks with Feast of Light, 113k total. That is the equivalent of like 3 to 4 T crashes, 3.5-ish T crashes, which is pretty crazy. And the DPS is between 7.5 to 9k. This Howl the Storm number, by the way, this was done on Riven. On other bosses, you can get a different kind of shatter scaling, which we'll retest more next season. Shout out to Spider, who kind of put me onto that. Yeah, you can do even more DPS with Howl the Storm on like normal model bosses that are not Riven. And so, yeah, if you find a Howl of the Storm Glacial Quake compatible boss, like the DPS can be pretty crazy and the total damage will be even higher, which is pretty nuts. Finally, we have our group of supers that you all know and love that are more familiar to us and are more, relevant for damage discussions. So, in terms of balancing, I thought it was kind of interesting that a lot of these top supers are basically tuned, or I don't know if this is intentional, but it looks intentional, are basically tuned to have very similar total damage, right? So Golden Gun with Nighthawk, 24.6k. Needle Storm with Star Eater Scales, 25k. Gathering Storm with Star Eater Scales, that is 25k. Blade Barrage with Star Eater Scales, that's 26k. Twilight Arsenal with Star Eater Scales, that's 25k. So they're all hovering around the 25k mark. You have some stuff as well, like Burning Maul with like Pyrogale, that's like 22k. A little bit of an outlier up here with Nova Bomb at like 29k. But yeah, all these supers are kind of tuned to have around the same total damage for being burst supers. So that's kind of cool. Nice little observation there. And then you have your class leaders, right? Which are the 3 up here. Number 1, you're going to have Nova Bomb, Star Eater Scales, 29k total, 16.2k DPS. By the way, the DPS values, once you get up into this territory where the supers literally take like 1 to 2 seconds to cast, these differences really don't matter. It's really differences down here that kind of start to matter when you're talking about some of the longer duration supers, but really the instant cast stuff, you're really looking at total damage. That's what matters more. Thunder Crash at 33k total, 16.7k DPS, and then Nighthawk, if you pre-pop it, obviously has the highest swap DPS in the game of anything, which makes sense. So some future notes, let's talk about those. Metaidoxia, how much of a buff does it need when it comes to Evolution Needlestorm to actually match Curious Thunder Crash? Because Bungie said in their article that they were going to buff Metaidoxia and buff like Needlestorm with Metaidoxia to the point where it would be competing with the likes of Curious Thunder Crash. Well, if you want to compete with the likes of Curious Thunder Crash, you're going to need to boost Needlestorm's damage by 58%. By 58% to match Courage Thunder Crash. So I don't want to be a doubter here, but I don't think Bungie is typically the type to buff something by 58% across one patch. So I'd be surprised. I'd love to be wrong, but I doubt Needlestorm will be as strong as Thunder Crash. But we'll see what happens. Okay, finally, for some reference stuff, Curious Thunder Crash currently does around 35% more damage than Nighthawk. So Nighthawk would need a 35% buff to kind of meet Curious Thunder Crash. It does 31% more damage than Twilight Arsenal because Twilight Arsenal with Star Eaters was nerfed because they made Star Eater 25% on Twilight Arsenal for some reason. I don't know. I would like Titan to have a better range super option. I mean, Twilight Arsenal is okay, but the fact that you need 6 orbs to pick up, whereas Curious doesn't need anything at all and is like a faster casting super, I don't know. I guess Twilight Arsenal has debuff. That is it for supers. I hope you guys learned something. There are numbers here, of course, that you can look at and pause the video, or you can look at the spreadsheet yourself if you're curious about these specifics. But I'm going to go ahead and move on to primaries. So let's go ahead and filter this tab by primaries, and let's go ahead and talk about the primary meta in this game right now. So first of all, you'll notice there's a big outlier at the top, and that's going to be Hierarchy of Needs with 3 guidance rings. Contrary to popular belief, I don't know, people don't really talk about this too much, I guess. Hierarchy with the 3 ring stacking thing, which I thought was unintentional to begin with. I thought you can only have 1 ring, and I thought the 3 ring thing was a bug and then it would get fixed. Bungie never responded to my tweet, but I assumed that the guidance ring triple stacking thing is intentional. And if it is intentional, you can see here that the Hierarchy of Needs shot itself does around 211 damage, whereas each of the sets of Seekers does over 300. So each ring is essentially multiplying Hierarchy's damage by over 2 times, right? So it's 2 times and 3 times and 4 times. And you can see here that the number it's 1467 versus just a regular 211. I mean, that is like 7-ish times damage increase, which is pretty insane, right? Most other primaries that are like buffed by other primaries or buffed by another like exotic are nowhere near that much. So that's pretty crazy. I mean, if we ever got an exotic that buffs bow damage more than Oathkeeper currently does, then you could see bows being meta. I mean, Hierarchy of Needs rings, they add pretty substantially to other bows as well, which we're going to talk about in the future. But if you're going to use just primary bows specifically, you should just stack hierarchies. I mean, Tiku's is like okay, but you can see here, even when I simulate having 3 rings on Tiku's, it still doesn't meet the same standard as hierarchy does. So if you're going to use just bow damage, you should go for hierarchy for just primary stuff. And that being said, I mean, I think hierarchy is also like a pretty decent like super generator if you use like other bows in the mix as well. But yeah, I don't know. I'm not like the biggest fan of it. Like 3.3k is like fine, but we have so many other like special and heavy options these days that not only don't take up your exotic slot, but also do good enough total damage to meet pretty much any phase duration. So I don't know. Exotic primaries, they had a short time, I guess, during DP with like Outbreak and everything, but these days, not really in the meta, and I don't think they will be for the next little while as well, going into Renegades. But still, if you're curious, yeah, Hierarchy, best exotic primary in the game. Some other stuff that's like worth mentioning, I suppose. Outbreak at max nanites, even after it's been shamed by the super changes. 2500 DPS, still pretty high, right? Final Warning, doesn't require any sort of nanite stacking, 2.1k. Rewind target lock, Antidote with Peacekeepers, that's at 1.9k. I'm not accounting for mods or anything like that, obviously. And then, or new gear bonus. And then you have Touch of Malice, 1.9k. That's pretty much all the relevant primaries. Going down here, I mean, you see some other stuff, like people have asked me to test Tommy's matchbook. Here it is. It's not good. 1k is just like, it's not even close to competitive. And then even like 2k, 2.5k, we are crept past that now. Like if you want a sustained damage option like Finality Mint or Finality SMG or whatever, that's going to be significantly higher than any of this stuff, even the Hierarchy of Needs entry. So I'm talking about primaries just for academic purposes. These are just not relevant in today's damage meta, but take a look at them if you want to. Okay, speaking of primaries, there is a primary subset that is a little bit more relevant and will potentially be more relevant next season, and that is going to be Lucky Pants. So as you can see here, these numbers are a lot more impressive than the numbers that we saw earlier. I mean, Hierarchy would literally slot in under Agape here. These are the classic options. Just going to rattle off some highlights. Malfeasance against Blighted Taken. So I actually don't have an entry here for this, but Malfeasance does 25% more damage to Taken, as well as gets an additional damage bonus against targets that are blighted by Witherhorde. So if you ever have a final stand on a day 1, where a target is a Taken boss and someone can just put on Witherhorde, Malfeasance does 4.5k DPS during its mag, which is pretty good stuff. Last Word, 2 mags with a dodge reload in between, 4.4k, 4.5k-ish. Not really worth it because the dodge reload requirement, but you know, that's a thing that exists, I suppose. Spread Shot, you guys might remember this thing where I stacked the Lucky Pants buff faster by like hip firing from slightly further away and like getting more of the pellets to hit, so I would get like more illegally modded holster stacks faster and faster. That's like not a thing that I would like to test with. It's also very inconsistent, so I just kept to 1 entry here. Even this 1 entry with Cascade Vorpal is like competing with Last Word and doesn't require dodge reload, so pretty good stuff here. You have Ariana's Vow, you know, with priming, that's like 4.3k. And then finally, you have Agape, which is 3.4k. Keep this number in mind, because I know a lot of people love Agape with Lucky Pants right now. I mean, just keep this number as a reference. If you guys love Lucky Pants this much with this hand cannon, which isn't even that good, there's probably going to be like more in store like Aureus and, you know, stuff like that in the future. I mean, Aureus is already better by a significant margin, but obviously you need to have like Cascade Point proc, which is not too much of an ask, but you know, that is just an option that you should be aware of if you want to do Lucky Pants right now before Renegades. So that is it for Lucky Pants. Let's go ahead and deselect, and we're going to go ahead and move on from primaries and start talking about specials. So specials, if we go ahead and filter the sustain tab by specials right over here, you'll see that double perk unvoiced is still class leading, but very situational. Does require you to get 15 red bar hits, I suppose. I mean, if you get the splash thing, it's a little bit better than that, but 15 red bar hits, and then you need to fill up on ammo completely again. And then if you have Assault Mag and Honing ×5 and you reload cancel, you get a DPS value of 5k, which is very, very impressive for a single legendary special, but it's redirection. So little cheating, and it's a double perk weapon, so little cheating. But I thought I'd include it here because there was a craze for redirection at some point. So just something to be aware of, I suppose, for like speedrunning and stuff like that. I probably wouldn't use it on like a day 1 or something like that. Up to you, but I probably wouldn't. Some other notable sustained options. So these two are obviously not sustained weapons, but Lord of Wolves, I actually retested Lord of Wolves several times across multiple patches. At some point, I think it was nerfed correctly. When they first said it got nerfed, I believe I tested it and it just didn't really seem like it had gotten nerfed, at least visually. But now on Savathun, I've retested and I'm pretty sure it has gotten nerfed. This value is a fair bit lower than it used to be. But yeah, 3.7k DPS with 75k total. That's still like fairly decent. So not horrible, but definitely like, I guess, settling more into a niche. And hot on its tail actually is Duality at 3.6k. Duality is a bit easier to use than Lord of Wolves. And the way the Duality works now is with On Black Wings, you can just shoot a boss with the pellet mode 3 times and then swap to the slug mode. And then you can the slug mode refreshes itself. So you can just have a pretty massive damage buff to your slug shots during that whole time. And yeah, 3.6k, pretty decent special DPS. Obviously, Mint being right next to it is a bit embarrassing, but once Mint gets 14 next season, it'll be a bit closer of a decision. But yeah, Honing Mint, 3.5k, that's a classic. You have Honing Praetus, Honing 4 times Charm Praetus with the Darcy buff. That's actually pretty close to Mint as well, but obviously requires someone to be on Darcy, and then it's a little bit more specialized as well. It's like more of a crit-specific weapon. And then you have New Land Beyond with a little bit of stacks. So I chose a number that's like between starting at 20 stacks versus starting at 0 stacks, which is like somewhere down here. The number realistically, if you start with like 10 stacks or something like that, and you do the sprint canceling with a reload buff, you get like 3.2k with some crazy total damage. Choir 1 Hipfire, I know that was like an option at some point that people were interested in, around 3.1k, not very impressive, but thought I'd mention it as a reference point. And then finally, Euphony. I know people are using Euphony this season because of pack tactics, but in terms of its actual damage, it's like 3k DPS, even if you have Threat of Evolution, so not particularly impressive. And then of course you have Numal Pice over here, sneaking it in. This number is not going to change next season, so even though Mint gets nerfed down to like 14, you'll see that the DPS is pretty similar between the two. Except Numal Pice has obviously a lot more total damage. Probably going to be close to like double the total damage next season once the reserve nerfs hit. And then for special burst options, obviously you have your classics like Merciless, right? 4.3k, but a little bit more total damage than most burst options. And the stuff I actually want to point out, I guess there's like 5 options I want to point out. The first one is, Horseman, Body Shot Mag. That's like still pretty decent. I think that's at like 6.3k down here. That's like more of a realistic option. You have a Cascade Point Slayer's Fang Mag at 5.2k, not too bad. Nighthawk Still Hunt without pre-popping is like 5k, but that number is going to skyrocket quite a bit next season. You have Charged Tessellation, pre-charge without reprocking. That's going to be at like 4.9k. And then Izzy with a Rehone, that's currently at 4.9k, which is pretty decent swap DPS. But next season with the reload scaling, obviously this number is going to go a lot higher. It's not going to take you 1.5 seconds to rehone your Izzy. So yeah, that's going to be pretty nice. And that's it for special weapons. Last but not least, let's go ahead and talk about power weapons. So power weapons, let's go ahead and filter by power on the sustain tab. And let's take a look at the top of the list. So I'm going to ignore Slide Shot Surrounded again for the same reasons as before. But yeah, rockets are still going to be leading the pack for single weapon dumps, right? It's going to be like 5.8k, 4.6k, etc. But they have abysmal total damage. I mean, look at this, 60k for a heavy weapon. We've compared against special weapons that have 150k, 160k, 180k, and yet rockets have a third of that. Rockets have literally like a third of the total damage of like New Land Beyond. So I don't think the burst to total damage is kind of, that ratio is computing for me, at least. I don't think rockets and heavy GLs are really going to be meta for anyone, I think, next season, besides like maybe solo players and speedrunners, which, if they want to keep it that way, that's fine. But, there's no reason for the average player base to really appreciate rockets and heavy GLs in the current state of things, especially with the way bosses are being designed these days with longer and longer phases. So that's something to note, I guess. Notable sustained options. We have Acreus coming in at 4.3k with 90k total, pretty decent. And then kind of the star of the show, right? It's like half the reason that I wanted to make this video, make some rotation stuff. Charged Bolts, Aggregate Charge, Submersion with 3 Guidance Rings. Now, even without the Guidance Rings, I think the DPS is somewhere around 3k, which is decent, I suppose. But 4k sustained damage with technically infinite total, right? So this is actually good enough. And again, Aggregate Charge, pretty easy to keep up. Charged Bolts, pretty reasonable. You don't need to retrieve with serrated bolts and have the damage be delayed or whatever. So, and then you have 3 guidance rings. I mean, yeah, you have to have 3 hierarchy users, but the hierarchy users can also be on submersion, right? So they can make their ring, keep in mind how long their ring is going to be up, and then shoot submersion and then go back to making another ring. I'm not the biggest fan of hierarchy. We did a lot of testing on it for like the past 2-day ones. And it was definitely finicky and definitely like a bit annoying. This is definitely like a number that's high enough that it's raising my eyebrows. So I just wanted to point it out to you guys. This is the base value of Aggregate Charge Submersion with 3 guidance rings. Without the guidance rings, again, it's like 2.9k, 3k, something like that. But the swap DPS is still pretty competitive even without the guidance rings. So I thought this was a potentially interesting option to bring into the discussion. Next, we have good legendary swords. So good legendary swords right here. These are around 3.7k. So really, you're going to be looking at stuff like Synancia, which has the higher impact compared to Summum Bonum, or you have Bequest with Surrounded, right? That's like the 2 big ones right now, Synancia and Bequest. They have pretty competitive total damage values because of Pack Hunter, and then 3.7 to 3.8k damage. Surprisingly, Honing and Surrounded, not that different from each other. So the era of Surrounded swords, like this DPS value is not that different. You could argue that waveframes are less annoying for piercing when it comes to, tracking to bosses and stuff like that compared to adaptives like Bequest. So people might even prefer to use the wave frame. I'm not going to talk about this Wolfsbane entry because it requires Outbreak, and it's kind of a whole separate thing. Leviathan's Breath, kind of surprising here at 3.6k, not too bad. Deathbringer, which is getting a grouping buff on the projectiles next season, 3.6k, pretty decent actually, surprisingly. And the total damage is not bad either. It's like Acreus-ish total damage. What else we got? Sleeper DPS, 3.4k. You might notice that a lot of exotic weapons that I've previously criticized are like appearing higher on this list. That's because last season, remember, I changed, or maybe it was this season, I changed everything on this list to use manual reload. So no reload assist, no rain of fire, nothing like that. And so a lot of weapons are shifting because of that. And so stuff like Sleeper is, going to get placed higher and stuff like that. But, even most DPS, rotations that people favor these days when it comes to bosses, when it comes to day one and stuff like that, they're all above 3.4, 3.6k. So I'm talking about this stuff just as highlights, not necessarily like recommendations or anything like that. So yeah, Sleeper, 3.4k. Heavy GL, good Heavy GL, 3.4k. And again, abysmal total damage. So you can see why I'm saying Heavy GLs and rockets are not really having a place in the meta right now. I mean, their DPS is not that great, and their total damage is horrible. And, why would you use them? Okay, next we have Whisper at almost 100k total, pretty good, 3.3k DPS. Wolfsbane, this is the actual relevant Wolfsbane row that I wanted to talk about. This is the, I guess, optimal-ish way to use Wolfsbane with Burning Ambition as well. Wolfsbane, in my opinion, has crazy total damage, 210k. That is crazy. So if you ever got a sword boss on a day one and you wanted a Lament-esque option that is like good for tracking, doesn't really pierce through the boss, solid overall, and it also has that DR effect as well, Wolfsbane is pretty good. If we ever get like a Crota type of boss again, it takes more damage from swords, or just swords are really optimal on him, you might use Synancia, but you might also consider Wolfsbane because this total damage is crazy. Like, it's crazy high. This is not with the Relentless either. Relentless would make the total damage skyrocket way, 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 way higher. But obviously the DPS would be a bit lower. But again, 3k dropping from 3k from like 3.7, 3.8k, not necessarily a trade you're willing to take all the time. So it's interesting. It's an interesting option, and we'll definitely retest it and reconfigure these numbers next season when they buff Wolfsbane like they said they were going to in the tuning article. Next we have Darcy, which I'm only mentioning because snipers, we're getting a heavy sniper next season. It's a legendary sniper, so in theory it should work with Darcy. So a Darcy user knowing how much damage they're going to do, that might be, of interest, I suppose. And then finally Thunderlord, classic option for day ones and stuff like that. 95k, 2.9k DPS. So I've obviously skipped over a bunch of options like Queenbreaker and whatnot because I think they're like a lot less relevant now. But if you're curious about this stuff, again, spreadsheet is linked in the description, and you can have a look at these numbers yourself. And if I did anything wrong, by the way, you guys can correct me. So if you guys want to see any values and you're like, whoa, this doesn't look like what I'm used to, go shoot a boss, go to like the firing range with no modifiers and sub 100 weapons and shoot a boss in the head or whatever, and make sure your numbers align with mine. They should align with all of these numbers in the visual value column. So if they don't, let me know. Leave me a message on Discord or something. Okay, and then finally, the last section of this video is going to be notable swap heavy weapons. So let's go ahead and filter. Oh yeah, it's a burst and swap. And we're going to go ahead and look at the heavy weapons. So Whirling Ovation and Parasite both do approximately, like this DPS value is very similar. So we're just going to say they would do approximately 20k swap DPS. A single frame difference in one of these values here when it comes to recording can tip the balance here. So yeah, just around 20k. Parasite with times 21 Worm's Hunger does more damage per shot than Whirling at 14% more with split surges. If you combine the surges or like you run like Sanguine or something, so it's like 1.25, the number's a lot closer, but that's just something you should be aware of. Whirling obviously will pull ahead performance-wise if you do not use Worm byproduct and you have something like Sanguine to assist with its surge problem. So that is something to keep in mind. Okay, Submersion swap DPS value is 12.6k, which is pretty insane given that this thing has auto-loading holster, and obviously the fire rate, which we dictated in the previous kind of discussion in the sustain tab, is based on manual reloads. So if you use stuff like Whisper of Impetus or Rain of Fire, or even just regular dodge reloads or like the speed loader thing, anything like that, and you will squeeze a lot more DPS out of this thing. So I'm curious to see what rotations we can kind of cook with this stuff. I know people were talking about kind of the speed loader stuff rotation before the epic race. And so, yeah, I want to take a look at that, see if there's any merit to it. And we'll have a conversation then. Hopefully that kind of testing in that video will be done before the end of the season. But if not, we'll definitely test it before the dungeon race. So keep your eyes peeled for that. That's going to be exciting. Okay, Grand Overture at 11k swap DPS. Again, everything up here, don't really worry about it. Like, these things take 2 seconds to cast or shoot. So the difference is really minor. Just look at the total damage, right? Total damage-wise, Grand Overture is like a little bit less than 2 whirling shots worth with split surges. That's all you need to know, really. Bait and Switch Adaptive Rocket, when it comes to swap DPS, you can see the values here. A single shot of Submersion does higher damage than a single rocket if you have 3 rings, and the swap DPS is higher. So that is why this drew my attention, by the way. This is why this drew my attention to submersion potentially being like a game-changing-ish DPS option. I do need to do a lot more testing with it. Don't get me wrong. Potentially very interesting. Potentially very interesting. Finalities Augur and Anarchy, which are both swap options. We already talked about this in the tick area, but you can see here directly that the time you take to deploy a Finalities Augur turret and then go back to your other weapons after marking a boss is in fact more worth it statistically than Anarchy, swapping to Anarchy and sticking to traps. And this is not even accounting for the fact that you have to manually reload Anarchy every 3 cycles because it has a 6 mag. And then finally, one last thing that I wanted to talk about, I guess Icebreaker is kind of cool. Parasite, the swap DPS with no stacks is 6.6k, which is still pretty substantially high, which is why Parasite swapping the chicken rotation is as good as it is. That is pretty much it. I've been talking for a very long time. I hope this video didn't bore you too much. I'll try to edit some footage on top of it so you don't get too bored. I have a feeling that I'm probably not going to be able to finish the damage rotation stuff by the time the Renegades NDA is lifted. So we're probably going to do damage rotation stuff toward the very end of the season, like right before Renegades launches. And then I'll just try to relax and, take my time with the rotations, have some fun with them. And then this is probably going to be the last like damage related video before the Renegade stuff, most likely. So I hope you guys enjoy. I'll try to edit this one because there's a lot of talking, a lot of spreadsheet. And I'll try to put some clips because obviously I have 250 gigabytes of clips worth of testing. So I'll try to throw some of that on the screen to entertain you guys. So that's it for now. Love you guys. If you guys managed to stick to this whole video and you listen to all my observations and my discussions of what's going to be meta potentially next season or what you should keep your eyes peeled for and compare against in Renegades, I hope you guys enjoyed that. There's definitely going to be lots of stuff to compare, whether we're talking Lucky Pants, whether we're talking, maybe a new rocket, maybe a new crossbow, maybe a new, it could be new anything really, new armor, new exotics, right? Everything. So just keep these reference numbers in mind. And I hope I've given you some highlights that you can kind of keep in your memory. And when Renegades comes out, I'll definitely come back to this discussion and we'll compare and see if these numbers hold up or not. That's it for now, and I'll see you guys later.